Chair recognizes Mr. Perry of Sandwich.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and through you to the members. And I appreciate the gentleman from Boston's comments, but let me start off by stating a few of those stubborn things called facts. The further amendment would preclude a vote on the underlying amendment, as we know, and the underlying amendment is not about just immigrants. The underlying amendment is about taxpayer-subsidized benefits for illegal immigrants. This amendment would do nothing, zero, for any legal resident of the Commonwealth. Not at all. The gentleman from Boston also said that the federal government should do something. I completely agree. The federal government, this president, this Congress, the prior president, the prior Congress have dropped the ball. They have failed to substantively reform our immigration system here in the United States. And that has left states like Massachusetts with very few options. But one of the options the federal government has given us is the SAVE system, S-A-V-E. And that system allows state agencies, for those states who opt in, and Massachusetts would not be the first state to do this, to say something very simple. And that thing is, when anyone applies for a benefit, anyone, and this bill is neutral on its face. This bill does not target any race, any ethnic group, anyone at all. It says when anyone applies for any state benefit, that person, the documents they present, must be verified by the federal government. And so what are we going to do if we do that? Someone comes in and let's say they're applying for a housing benefit, a taxpayer-subsidized housing benefit that likely has a very long list of people on that waiting list to get that benefit. That state agency or town agency, or whatever the case may be, would take those documents, transmit them to the federal government, and they would say, that person is here legally. That person is not in jail. That person is not collecting benefits in some other state. That person is not the victim of identity fraud. That sounds like good public policy to me. That sounds like something we would want to do as stewards of the taxpayers' dollars. Wouldn't we want to make sure that anyone getting any benefit that's coming from taxpayers' dollars is entitled to that benefit legally? We should want to do that all the time. But shouldn't we want to do it especially this year? In this budget, you are going to vote to reduce local state aid.
Chair apologizes to the gentleman with the microphone. For what purpose did the lady rise? Does the gentleman yield for a question?
The gentleman yields.
Gentleman yields. The chair recognizes Ms. Malia of Boston.
One of the pieces that I'm not quite sure I understand about this, and that's why I wanted to ask, is for clarification. We would have the federal government duplicate a process that's already existed, but who would pay for those systems? Do we know how many federal immigration agents work in the Boston office, and how would we process this information through the system?
Chair recognizes Mr. Perry of Sandwich.
I thank the gentle lady from Boston for the question. The Department of Homeland Security, the federal agency, is the administrator of this SAVE program. It is all done electronically. So the state agency, as I was telling the story, will say it's a housing agency, transmits the documents electronically to the Department of Homeland Security. I am told it takes about 6 minutes and costs about $6 per verification, and that cost is borne by the agency or the state. I feel very confident, based upon what other states have seen in their savings and just common sense, that the rooting out of fraud, the elimination of illegal immigrants getting these benefits, would save us a whole lot more than the $6 per transaction.
Chair apologizes to the gentleman at the microphone. For what purpose, gentleman rise? Gentleman yield for a question.
Gentleman yields.
Chair recognizes Mr. Bosley of North Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding for a question. I'm wondering if the gentleman has any statistics or any idea of how much fraud is out there or how many illegals are actually getting benefits right now. I think that's important as we weigh the cost. Even if it's $6 per application or per transaction, if you're doing that for everybody so that you're not discriminating, that $6 adds up pretty fast, and I'm curious as to what the gentleman estimates that we would save through this.
Chair recognizes Mr. Perry of Sandwich.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from North Adams for the question. Sadly, all I have is anecdotal information, because despite my attempts to contact state agencies, including the governor's office, no one is counting. No one is checking. No one knows how many illegal immigrants we have on state benefits, because we're not asking, we're not checking in most instances. Now, some will come up here later and tell you that some agencies are checking, and I concede the point. I've heard that some state agencies are checking, asking that question. But there is no uniform policy across this Commonwealth. And I would also like to add, the gentleman from Boston in his opening remarks made a suggestion that was untrue. He mentioned the word children. He mentioned the word immigrants. I've already clarified that this bill does not get at immigrants only, it gets at illegal immigrants. And just to further clarify, this amendment and bill, if you will, does not get at children. No one under the age of 18 would be subject to this. And while I'm on that general topic, this amendment does also not get at short-term issues, does not get at emergency situations, immunization, emergency medical care, emergency shelter, emergency food. This amendment is designed after legislation that's been approved in Colorado and Georgia, which is aimed at getting at the long-term abuses of illegal immigrants in our social entitlement programs. Now, we don't know how many illegal immigrants are gaining access to benefits in Massachusetts. And this institution and the state government in general has had the opportunity to look at this. What I'm speaking on right now is a motion by the gentleman from Boston for a further study. If you will recall, I stood here last year with this same amendment in the context of a very difficult budget situation, and I lost my amendment because it was further studied. Sadly, there is no study from last year. Sadly, there is never a study on these further studies. Sadly, as individual members and as an institution, we are giving away our power to the leadership, because right now this will probably be studied. Maybe not, I'll remain optimistic. And so my issue that's important to me and important to millions of constituents across this Commonwealth won't have a clean, honest vote. Last week it was my good friend from Dennis who wanted an issue and a vote before the floor, but it was further studied. And I don't have to list them all. I would say in the last month there has been more further studies than in the previous 7 years I have been here. It is a policy and procedure and tactic which is eroding the credibility of this institution and diminishing your power as individual legislators. I have no problem at all debating the merits of this issue. I know many of you don't agree with me.